Hello, thank you for listening to this podcast. My name is Dustin Burden, and I call this Careful Consideration. This podcast and the website also with it is where I explore the intersection of ethics, culture, and theology. I try to help people carefully consider moral issues and give a Christian ethical response to them. I also hope to help non-Christians see the truth and beauty of God as seen through rational ethical thinking. In this episode, I want to continue with a series I started in the last episode on transgenderism, addressing the gender identity crisis in our culture presently. America has many societal issues. We all know that. One of these significant societal challenges is the gender identity debate, or transgenderism. The data shows that most Americans know someone personally who either questions their gender identity or they've come out as transgender. Christians cannot ignore this cultural issue either, since it has impacted those in the church as well. My goal with these episodes is to equip listeners with the key pieces of information so we can think rightly about this issue. I want to give this disclaimer. I said it in the last episode. I will probably say it every time I talk about transgenderism or even homosexuality. I want to make this very clear. Our aim and my goal it should never be, to verbally beat down nor demean those who identify as transgender. Rather, our aim should be to help those that are caught up in the gender identity crisis trap. So again, the goal is to help. It is not to beat down. And I call this series Addressing Transgenderism with Truth, Love, and Grace. And I really want to hone in on those three words, truth, love, and grace. Our aim must be to help these people by sharing the truth with them, but sharing the truth with the love of Christ and a tone of grace. In the previous episode, I introduced the concept of what we actually mean by transgenderism, or when someone says they are transgender. We explored some relevant data to paint the current picture of the gender identity issue in America. I also shared the cause of transgenderism from a Christian perspective. If you haven't listened to that episode, I would encourage you to go do that so you can be caught up on the relevant pieces of information. We are going to talk about some new stuff now, and this episode will probably be the first out of two. And what I'm going to do with this one and the next is highlight some major flaws with the gender identity theory, or transgender theory. There's more than two, but I have chosen to focus on the top two critical errors with transgender theory. These fallacies prove to me, and I believe they should to any rational thinking person, that transgender theory is built on erroneous ideas. These key flaws can help people come to grips with the fact that transgender theory, it is illogical and it's in serious error. My hope is that Christian and non-Christian listeners alike will see that transgender theory is irrational and does not warrant our approval. Well, in this episode, I'm going to introduce the first of these two critical flaws. And what I want to show in this one is that transgender theory is not driven by objective scientific evidence. Rather, it is driven by subjective cultural shifts. One disclaimer I have for you so I don't cause any confusion. You will probably hear me say the term modern gender theory and the term transgender theory throughout this episode. Those mean the same thing. So if you hear me switching it up, just know I'm talking about the same thing. So here is the first critical flaw with transgender theory. And it is that transgender theory, or modern gender theory, is culturally driven. So it's culturally driven. It is not scientifically driven. This is a critical flaw with modern gender theory. It is subjectively based, not objectively based on evidence. It is, we could say, a shifting sand type theory. Now, my claim is that when we examine the history of how the field of psychiatry has dealt with transgenderism, we can see that the so-called experts have most likely been following the cultural and political whims of change in how they have dealt with transgenderism. They have not been following good, clear, evidential science. So the first way I'll explain this is let's look at some changes in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The American Psychiatric Association, or I'll call that the APA for the rest of this. So the APA uses the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of mental disorders. Now, I know that's a mouthful. I'm going to just refer to that with the acronyms of the DSM. So that DSM, what you need to know about it, why it's important to our study here, it is an authoritative reference book for officially diagnosing and treating mental disorders. So a psychiatrist who is licensed and they're in the APA, that's the American organization, the official organization that the psychiatrists are a part of to hold their licensings and their credentials and all those things. Okay, their official guidebook is what I'm going to call this DSM. That is what psychiatrists go off of to officially diagnose what mental disorder someone may have, and it shares with them the best practices for proper treatment. Okay, so keep that in mind because that's what we're looking at here. I want to show you the history of how this book put out by the psychiatrist. I want to show you the history of how it has dealt with transgenderism. The current DSM in publication is in the 5th edition. That 5th edition was published in the year 2013. Now, in the year 2022, the APA published what they call a text revision to that 5th edition. Now, that's not very germane to all this now, but I just want you to know that it's currently in its 5th edition. Okay, so we're going to go back in time and look at 2 previous editions, and I'm going to show you how they used to deal with transgenderism. The DSM 3rd edition, which was published in 1980, and the 4th edition, which was published in 1994, they included a mental disorder called gender identity disorder. The DSM 4th edition text revision, it defined gender identity disorder using 2 main criteria. The first was, it was when a person had a strong and persistent cross-gender identification. Now, that's important because that definition did not include that someone must experience distress or discomfort over wanting to be a different gender than the one that they were born with. Now, the second criteria did include that someone could experience discomfort arising from their belief that their birth gender is not who they should be. But again, I point out to you that the former editions of the DSM, when it listed gender identity disorder, it did not necessitate that someone experience discomfort over believing they should be a different gender. Now, the key here is the word disorder. Well, let's think about what psychiatrists mean by the word disorder. That is when behaviors are considered abnormal, psychologically imbalanced, or distressing. Simply put, a disorder means something's not normal. It is rather a deviation from what should be normal. The official psychological definition of a mental disorder is, quote, any condition characterized by cognitive and emotional disturbances, abnormal behaviors, impaired functioning, or any combination of these, end quote. Now, I want you to notice that up until the DSM 5th edition, again published in the year 2013, psychiatrists and psychologists believed that a person's persistent desire to be a different gender, other than the one they were born with biologically, and any resulting discomfort over that, they believed that should be considered a mental disorder. Again, it was not the norm, it was a disorder, and people needed psychiatric help for that. Well, I'm using the term gender identity disorder. What about specifically the term transgender or transgenderism? Before the DSM 5th edition, the previous editions, especially the 3rd and the 4th, they included transgender as a term in their book, and that meant they viewed transgenderism as a mental disorder. Psychiatrists and psychologists understood transgenderism to again be abnormal human behavior, not normal. The DSM 5th edition, again in 2013, it dropped the term transgenderism entirely. They just cleared it out of the book. Well, what about the term gender identity disorder? Well, here's what they did, and this is where I'd like you to hone in on this and pay attention. What they did with gender identity disorder is they changed the terms. They came up with a new term. Rather than calling it gender identity disorder, they call it gender dysphoria. Now, the APA defines gender dysphoria as, quote, a marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender, and they have to undergo this feeling of at least 6 months duration, and it can vary in degrees of intensity, end quote. I covered gender dysphoria in detail in the last episode. Let me just say this in brief so we can all be on the same page. Gender dysphoria is the psychiatric term for when someone experiences discomfort or distress to some degree. So again, they have to experience mental distress for at least 6 months, and what they experience distress over is the fact that they believe they should be a different gender other than the one they were born with. Okay, so that is the current terminology used in the DSM 5th edition. That's the term that psychiatrists of today are operating off of. Now, a change in terminology can be understandable if, and this is a big if there is sufficient evidence to support the shift in terminology. This evidence would need to be consistent, though, with updated research and findings in the field of psychiatry. However, my argument is this is not the case when it comes to the APA's dropping the term transgenderism entirely, and then they alter gender identity disorder and want to call it gender dysphoria. Let me explain as I go through here. With the publishing of the DSM 5th edition, the APA released special notes about this new term that they were, at the time, they were going to come out with it, that term gender dysphoria. Well, now they have come out with it. Well, what they did is in these special notes, they gave their rationale for why they stopped calling this gender identity disorder. Let me read you some of what they said. The APA said, quote, the DSM 5th edition aims to avoid stigma and ensure clinical care for individuals who see and feel themselves to be a different gender than their assigned gender. It replaces the diagnostic name, gender identity disorder, with the new one, gender dysphoria, as well as makes other important clarifications in the criteria, end quote. Okay, so the reason the APA feels the need to change from the term gender identity disorder, and then they dropped transgenderism entirely out of the book. Well, the reason they said they felt the need for this stuff was to avoid stigma, because they believe that transgenderism is no longer a mental disorder. Here's another quote of where they say this. They say, quote, it is important to note that gender nonconformity, or transgenderism, is not in itself a mental disorder, end quote. Okay, so they bluntly point out that with the publishing of the 5th edition, the current one, they felt it was stigmatizing to refer to people whose gender identity does not match their birth gender. They said, we can't call that a disorder anymore. That's stigmatizing. And they outright say they don't believe transgenderism is a mental disorder any longer. That is a significant change, and we need to take it serious to understand the flaw I'm going to explain now in transgender theory. Think with me for a second. How can a mental disorder, if it was a real mental disorder, how can it suddenly no longer be a mental disorder? Well, there's only one of two possibilities. Either option A, it never was a mental disorder to begin with, and they wrongly labeled it. Option B, it really was and still is a mental disorder, but they simply just don't want to call it that any longer. Well, let's think about this as we go through here with those two possibilities as to which one could be true. Well, my argument is the American Psychiatric Association is not engaging in scientific studies and clear evidence to make these changes. They are engaging in what I'm going to call wordplay games. So this is mental disorder wordplay going on here, and I believe I can prove that. The APA dropped transgenderism from classification as a disorder, and again, they currently only view the significant distress that can arise from being transgender as a disorder. And remember, they're calling it gender dysphoria. They're no longer calling it gender identity disorder. So I need to make this clear as a reminder before we move on. Currently, psychiatrists no longer view transgenderism as a mental disorder. All that they view as a possible mental disorder is if someone begins to experience the significant distress over being transgender. Now, if they don't experience any distress over it, they're not going to label them as having any kind of disorder. And even then, they don't want to call it a disorder. They made up this new word, dysphoria. So again, even in the term gender dysphoria, they do not want to refer to that as a disorder. I mean, they could have called it gender dysphoria disorder, but they didn't. Well, I firmly believe this is clear evidence that the APA is following the winds of change in American society. It's difficult to see how the APA can justify the shift from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria and claim that they did so for justifiable reasons based on research findings. It is even more challenging to see how they believed for decades that transgenderism was a mental disorder, but as of 2013, all of a sudden, it's no longer a mental disorder. The APA goes on to say about their changes, quote, "This diagnosis," meaning the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, "is a revision of the DSM 4th edition's criteria for gender identity disorder and is intended to better characterize the experiences of affected children, adolescents, and adults," end quote. The APA believes the change in terminology is justified based on the experiences of those who are transgender. Well, before the DSM 5th edition, psychiatrists viewed transgender people as disordered. With the publishing of the 5th edition, psychiatrists are now supposed to view transgender people as different maybe, but not abnormal, not disordered. So therefore they say the term disorder no longer fits. Well, there's an issue with the APA's logic of basing their determination of disorders on the experiences of affected children, adolescents, and adults. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, okay? I'm an ethicist. But it seems to me illogical to let the subject's experience determine whether they have a mental disorder. For example, suppose a man has schizophrenia. I mean, we all know that is a mental disorder. Well, suppose you have a schizophrenic case here. Would the psychiatrist determine whether this man needs clinical care based on the patient's experience? Or should the psychiatrist determine the care required based on objective standards from the field of psychiatry? To me, the logical answer is the psychiatrist makes the care plan based on objective known facts about dealing with schizophrenia. Now, don't get me wrong here. Sure, they do ask this patient, what is their experience? What are they going through? What are they feeling? But my point is, they don't let the patient determine whether or not they have a problem. They're going to listen to the patient and then use objective facts to say, you do have a problem and you need treatment for this. Let's take another example from the medical field. Suppose there's a woman who shows to have breast cancer after a mammogram. The physician informs her of the terrible news. However, what if the woman said to the physician, "My experience, though, is that my breast cancer is normal and not abnormal. Please do not stigmatize me by calling me a breast cancer patient." Well, now she has a right to think whatever she wants, but it does not change the fact that breast cancer is an issue that needs to be addressed. Breast cancer would be abnormal, not normal. It's not advantageous to the human body. In fact, it can be detrimental and deadly to the human body. Now, someone could push back against my examples I've shared by pointing out that something like cancer has been clearly proven to be harmful to the body. It's a malfunction in bodily function. Perhaps my example does not work for transgenderism because transgenderism is how someone feels, and it's not a disease causing harm to their body. Well, we can respond to this, though, by using simple logic. Using logic and rational thinking, let's be honest and ask ourselves if this situation sounds mentally healthy. Suppose there is a biological male. Around age 12, this boy firmly believes he should be a girl. His self-perception of his proper gender identity and expression is female, not male. This biological male begins to wear feminine clothing. He adopts a feminine name. He desires others to treat him as a woman. In fact, he begins to demand it. He wishes he could go further and physically change into a woman. So he begs his parents to let him take hormone pills so that he can grow breasts like a woman. He even wishes that as he gets older, he could undergo surgeries to alter his physical appearance to be every bit of a woman as he can be. Now, I ask any sane, rational thinking person this question. Does any of that situation sound mentally normal and healthy? Forget what culture says, forget what social media influencers say or what politicians may say. Simply use your logical faculties of rational thought and ask if that sounds normal. That situation I laid out, unfortunately, is not hypothetical. That is the experience of many people who identify as transgender. But I strongly believe any rational person would feel like they should step in and help this boy understand who he is meant to be is the male that he was born to be. Sane people would want to help this boy work through his feelings and bring him to a place of clear thinking and acceptance of the engendered body God gave him at birth. I believe it takes an irrational mindset to think that the best response to this boy would be to affirm him in his quest to be the opposite gender other than the male that he was born to be. It seems ludicrous and unhelpful to encourage him to take hormone treatments and surgically alter his body to be someone that honestly he can never be biologically or spiritually speaking. Now, would the APA ever entertain a revision of a future edition of the DSM that, for example, removes schizophrenia as a disorder because they do not want to stigmatize those with schizophrenia? Would the APA reach a point where they believe schizophrenic behaviors can be considered normal and no longer abnormal? I hardly think so. At least I hope not. Well, why does the APA treat transgenderism differently? I submit it is because the winds of culture and its accompanying politics have shifted to support and affirm transgender identities openly. Those in opposition to my views might argue that perhaps society and its psychiatrists were too harsh on transgender people in the past. Maybe the APA was discriminating against transgender people. Maybe it took decades to finally reach the point that they came to in the year 2013 by no longer considering transgenderism a mental disorder. Can a modern transgender movement be seen in the same light as perhaps the civil rights movement? Are transgenders a class of people whom the majority of society has discriminated against for decades? I've heard this argument before where people try to claim that transgenders should be considered completely mentally normal, and they'll try to make this case that yes, they are sort of like the civil rights issue. However, there is no comparison between the LGBTQ plus community and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was about one ethnicity mistreating and discriminating another ethnicity. A person is born with their ethnicity. They do not develop it. They don't come into it later in life. There is no scientific evidence that proves transgender people are born with their transgenderism. So we cannot claim that this is one class of people being mistreated by another. The issue at stake with transgenderism is whether it is a mental disorder or not. Well, the APA for decades believed transgenderism was a mental disorder, and in 2013 simply erased it from being considered a mental disorder. Did they do this for scientific reasons? No. They admit it was to avoid stigmatizing people who are transgender. Again, my claim is the only reason the APA was worried about stigmatizing transgender people is because the cultural and political affirmation of them had grown to historical levels, and the APA felt they needed to alter their wording. The APA's move to drop transgenderism from the DSM is also very ironic because even within the pro-transgender community, there is debate over this move. If the APA had kept the term transgenderism as a mental disorder label, then kids, adolescents, and adults could have been diagnosed with it. That would have then opened up access to insurance-covered treatments and protections. But by dropping transgenderism from the DSM, transgender people can no longer receive insurance-covered treatments. Instead, they can only receive officially covered treatments if they go one step further. They have to express mental distress over being transgender for at least 6 months and consequently get diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Here's the irony as I see the situation for the APA. They wanted to avoid stigmatizing transgender people by labeling them as having a mental disorder. So they dropped transgenderism from the DSM entirely. However, that action removed any access to gender therapy treatments for transgender people. The APA knew they had to still somehow provide a label for transgender people to receive treatments if they desired so. but that old gender identity disorder label was offensive and stigmatizing. Thus, they created the new label, gender dysphoria, and dropped the word disorder altogether. Ironically, though, to get access to care, the transgender person must be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Why is this ironic? Because the term of gender dysphoria, it's a mental disorder. Well, how do we know it's a mental disorder if it doesn't say the word disorder in its label? Well, because the term gender dysphoria is located in the APA's book called Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of what? Mental Disorders. Remember, that's what the DSM is, an official authoritative book for psychiatrists to determine if someone has a mental disorder and the appropriate treatment options. So gender dysphoria is in that book. Even though they dropped the word disorder, it is a disorder because it exists in the DSM. I believe the APA wants to have its cake and eat it too. They do not want to call transgenderism a disorder, but for someone to receive any gender therapy treatments, they have to be labeled with the mental disorder called gender dysphoria. The APA is attempting to make distinctions that have no fundamental difference. The APA is engaging in wordplay, not facts and evidence. In conclusion to this episode, I have attempted to show that the American Psychiatric Association, which is America's leading authoritative body of psychiatrists, is not following objective-based scientific facts in their handling of transgenderism. They engaged in wordplay as they attempted to avoid calling transgenderism a mental disorder like they used to. But the treatments for transgender people require that they be diagnosed with a mental disorder. These facts show modern transgender theory is culturally and politically driven, not scientifically driven. Transgender theory is based on faulty, shifting sand ideas. I hope listeners use this information to guard their minds from succumbing to the erroneous claims that transgender theory is based on scientific, research-backed evidence. It most certainly is not. Again, my name is Dustin, and I thank you for listening to this episode of Careful Consideration. You can find out more of my articles and episodes at www.dustinburden.com. Thank you.